Hello and welcome to the Washington Urban Debate League's Junior Varsity Video Series. In this video, I'm going to introduce the Critique of Capitalism. We're going to introduce the argument, break it down into its different parts, talk about it using the critique in a round, and talk about how to answer the critique as the affirmative. So when I talk about critiquing capitalism, what am I talking about? Well, critiques are arguments that question the assumptions of the affirmative. The assumptions can range from the justification of why we do the affirmative, what sort of advantages we choose to claim, and the things we portray as positive outcomes, such as economic growth, what the root causes of the problem truly are, and is the solution just a band-aid versus a permanent solution addressing some of these root causes. Thus, every affirmative should be portrayed as a tool of the capitalist machine driving us toward poverty, environmental destruction, and ruin. When I use the word capitalism, I'm referring to an economic system based on the idea of a free exchange of goods and services with minimal government regulation or government ownership of business. Capitalism has some other defining characteristics: the ownership of private property by individuals, competitive markets, the incentive to make a profit for innovation and labor, the mobility of labor, meaning the ability of a worker to go from one job to another depending on the wages offered, and in modern times, the free exchange of goods, services, and labor across national boundaries in international trade. I note, capitalism is not about spending money. That's a trait of any economy, not capitalism specifically. Let's jump right in with the link debate. Every affirmative links to capitalism in multiple detailed, nuanced ways. If you don't see them, you're not looking outside the box far enough. Let's go through some of the ways that most affirmatives on this topic link to capitalism. The first is workforce development, which I like to call developing little capitalists. Many affirmatives are trying to teach students skills to go into the workforce and increase their production, aka becoming cogs in the capitalist machine and furthering the system. Second is the idea of new markets. Education is largely a public enterprise, isolated from capitalism because it's run by the government. School choice, for example, is a step towards privatization, aka capitalism, which lets capitalist forces start governing education instead of the public interest. Additionally, many cases encourage schools to buy things, such as standardized testing modules, new STEM programs, or career and technical education programs, curricular standards, new textbooks, you name it. All of this is creating new markets for businesses to sell things to schools. Third is a question of inequality. Many minorities and the poor often get lower quality education because of the way education is funded in this country. It's tied to local property taxes. If you live in a poor neighborhood, the neighborhood raises less taxes, meaning that less money is spent on local schools, re-entrenching this inequality. Capitalism, as an economic system, accepts and embraces the idea of inequality being necessary and often makes it much worse. Thus, existing poverty and inequality is capitalism's fault. Assuming otherwise, or pitching the myth of social mobility or the culture of poverty are common tools to hide capitalism and justify its existence. Next could be a discussion of science and technology dependence in our society. The assumption that we can solve all of our problems by just inventing new solutions is short-sighted, driven not by a desire to solve the problems or a way to solve structural challenges, but by a desire for profits, to make money by selling whatever is newly invented. Next is the idea of labor management. A side effect of school choice is breaking the power of the teachers' unions, a check against the negative consequences of capitalism. Things like testing and accountability are tools to govern teachers from above, further restricting the power of labor. And lastly, let's talk about defining success. What is it? Is it happiness, friendship, the greater good? No. Capitalism has defined success as making money and growing the economy, constantly seeking more material goods than we already have. When it comes to the impact debate, most negative outcomes can be attributed to capitalism. They can fall into three big categories. First, the structural. Capitalism is the root cause of inequality, poverty, racism, sexism, etc. Second, can be event-based. Capitalism can encourage countries to compete over resources, causing war, and it can contribute to global warming via pollution. The third is the epistemological or the ethical. Profit motivations encourage the dehumanization of population and nature in the pursuit of ever-growing profits and money. This can destroy the way we value life and our ability to appreciate what we already have. Lastly is the solvency attacks. Strong critiques of capitalism attack the solvency of the affirmative. We can't believe the predictions of success, such as market growth, from the affirmative, since they are written by people with profit motives or in service of the capitalist machine. Specific examples can make this attack very effective. Lastly is the alternative debate. The alternative in the WUDL core file is called community schooling, similar to the idea that it takes a village to raise a child. Instead of a capitalist-driven model of education, the first affirmative constructive, we should collectively define community issues and train students in the skills needed to solve them. For example, if global warming is the problem, then we should teach students sustainable building, sustainable agriculture, recycling, chemistry, and other sciences to create renewable energies and other ways to solve a direct community problem. Being able to provide specific examples that don't sound like hippie communes is the best way to win that the alternative isn't a big risk or a bad idea. Let's touch on the framework debate. Critiques usually challenge that a policy option has to be the response to the first affirmative constructive. This critique is an exception because it offers a policy alternative. The idea of community schools can be implemented with the support of government agencies. There might be benefits to challenging the state-centered nature of debate. This is an advanced technique that can take more time, so don't do it just because you can. Use framework so that you can articulate a big reason why doing so only if it helps your advocacy. So how do we use the critique of capitalism to win a debate? In the first negative constructive, remember, critiques usually take a long time to read. The evidence is usually longer, full of big words, and very complex ideas, so be sure to highlight effectively and only read what you need to say. Read a link that is specific to the first affirmative, an impact, and an alternative, and a framework if you need it. Remember to save time for other arguments, using only 3 or 4 minutes maximum on the critique. In the block, the critique can become a powerful weapon, especially if you have multiple threatening arguments in the first negative constructive so that the affirmative undercovers the critique. First, like with any argument, give an overview in your own words about the thesis of your criticism. Here's an example. Capitalism is destroying the global economy, and the plans focused on science and technology will only further economic growth and global pollution. Only a locally oriented community schooling program can break the cycle of destruction. Make sure to debate the link. In the 1NC, you read a single link, so be sure to extend that. Second, answer any arguments the other team made on the link debate, and then bury them. Read a link wall of at least 3 new separate reasons why the affirmative case links to the critique. At least 2 of these should be based in evidence. Make sure to answer the do both arguments the other team makes. If you win links, they can't do both. Be aware for severance and intrinsicness, theoretical objections discussed in the state's counterplan video. Drawing examples from the 1AC evidence or rhetoric to illustrate your links is the best way to connect abstract theory of capitalism to the case at hand. Here's an example. The affirmative Smith evidence talks about school choice as a way to remove restrictions from schools. These restrictions prevent predatory capitalism from turning the classroom into a marketplace. Next, extend the impact, answering any arguments they've made, and read another, related to the advantages of the case. For example, if the affirmative plan claims to solve global warming, talk about how capitalism destroys the environment. This lets you make a turns case argument and helps you argue that structural issues prevent them from solving. Lastly, engage the affirmative case on solvency, which is a great way to throw doubt on their case and strengthen your own. Here's an example. If the first affirmative predicts a reduction in poverty if we just add a little bit more capitalism, you can't trust their evidence. It's written by folks who have a profit incentive to make models supporting the capitalist system and ignore the structural inequality the system creates. Be sure to extend your alternative and answer any arguments they've made against it. Explain it in your own words, using real-world examples. If they read any independent offense, be sure to answer that as well. If you're going to go for the critique in the block, you need to offer other credible threats in the other speech. This means the first affirmative rebuttal won't have time to answer the critique effectively. Extend the link arguments they don't have time to respond to properly. Expand on an impact and do impact calculus, including time frame, magnitude, and probability. Extend the alternative and answer any do-both arguments or offense extended in the first affirmative rebuttal. Focus on the turns case arguments and how the critique interacts with the affirmative, demonstrating a strong understanding of the theory and how it applies. So how do you answer the critique of capitalism when you are the affirmative? There are two main ways to do so. I like to call them the run and hide strategy or the offense strategy. If your affirmative encourages economic growth, tries to train people for the workforce, or generally links really hard to the critique, embrace it. Defend that capitalism is good. If you don't think you link, you can go for the defensive strategy of run and hide. We'll walk through the link debate, the impact debate, the alternative debate, and some offense you can use. On the link debate, if you link hard to the capitalism critique, don't waste your time contesting the link. They're going to beat you, and it's a waste of your valuable time. You can make nuanced arguments like capitalism is inevitable and making do-both arguments. These are things that can allow you to win time trade-offs, especially if you explain them in a nuanced fashion. For example, do the plan while embracing the spirit of the critique, etc. If you don't link very hard, definitely contest the link. Figure out their specific lines of attack and contest them early, starting in cross-examination. Some affirmatives can actually win a link turn, such as the civics affirmative. This case is trying to reclaim education away from economics as a space for civics instead of workforce preparation, and it otherwise doesn't really take a stand on economics. The impact debate, let's break down your options. If you link to the critique of capitalism, go nuts. There are lots of ways to generate offense. First, explain how a lack of capitalism would cause terrible things, and the transition away from capitalism would be a terrible, chaotic time. Second, explain how capitalism solves the problems they identify instead of causing them, and solving a bunch of other beneficial things. And third, explain how capitalism reduces structural inequalities. The evidence in the file about capitalism lifting people out of poverty is probably the best and most qualified evidence on either side of the debate in the file. If you don't really link to the critique of capitalism, you can read some impact defense. Capitalism can solve some harms, capitalism is inevitable, and you can talk about how capitalism has adjusted and become more regulated post the 2009 financial crisis to reduce the likelihood that the harms of capitalism come to pass. When it comes to the alternative debate, you can make a lot of waves here. The alternatives fall into three main categories. The first is some form of communism or socialism, which history tells us has been ineffective at best and genocidal at worst. Secondly, they could fall into some idea that hasn't been tested yet, which is difficult to trust as superior to a system of capitalism that we know well. And third, they are often sketchy and excessively intellectual, and likely probably impossible to practically implement. Figure out which the critique is, and then attack them for it. Don't be afraid to bring additional offense into it. The alternatives to capitalism are probably worse, even if capitalism is flawed itself. Be sure to focus on the idea of transitioning away from capitalism. It's not like people who have succeeded in the current system won't resist and fight back. Capitalism being inevitable is a sneaky argument. It can make the case not link. It can also make sure that the alternative doesn't solve.